I've talked to hundreds of developers building with the Next.js App Router, probably looked at over 1,000 different repositories, and here are the top 10 mistakes that I've seen that hopefully can help improve your Next.js application. Let's get into it. Okay, first is thinking you need to call route handlers from your React server component. Now, I have to step back a little bit here and talk about what a route handler is in the first place. A route handler allows you to have verbs, HTTP verbs like get, post, put, and delete, for example, and have a API exposed that allows you to get some data or mutate some data. Now, for folks coming from the pages router world, they might think, wow, this seems basically like the same thing as API routes. And that's usually where the mistake comes in. You make a route handler like this, which is a get. It returns some JSON response that is hello world. And I go back inside of my page. I mark it as async. I say, okay, I want to have fetch to localhost /3000 API. I'll get back this JSON data, and then I'll print it out here in the H1. And this does work, but it's actually kind of a mistake because for two reasons. One, you have to hard code the full URL because you're here in the Node.js context. But two, you actually don't even need that extra step or that extra network request because this runs securely on the server as well as this running securely on the server. Instead, you could just put that JSON here. You could just call that await get user or whatever that function is here, whatever that promise is directly without needing to use the route handler in the middle. So typically when I see something like this, I would cut it and it would be let data equals await, either fetching to somewhere externally and not having the route handler in between, or just calling that function that you've abstracted out here as well too. So that's number one. Okay, building off this for number two, let's talk about the defaults for route handlers. This is another place that I see people get mixed up. So let's say you did need a route handler for some reason. I think most of the time when I see people actually needing route handlers, it's for handling webhooks or for handling some sort of external request in their application. Maybe it's for scaffolding out something like Next.auth, for example. But they create a route handler just to test things out. So they make something like this, and they're wondering why. Let's say I put in something like date, and let's do something like this. So I have a date, and I have a new date, and a local string of New York. Now, if I go to localhost 3000 /API, I'm going to see this new date string. And if I reload the page, I'm getting a new date on every single request. Now, there's two opportunities here to better understand how this model works. The first is understanding the difference between local and production. So in local, even though this data is cached, which I'm going to get to in a second, you're going to get a new value. It's going to get recreated on every single request. And secondly is understanding why this is cached by default. So let me show the first one. Let me open up my terminal, and I'm going to run build and run start. So I'm going to do a production build in my application, and then I'm going to start up my local dev server, my production server on my local host. So now if I go back to here and I reload the page, it never changes. So this is a difference between how your local dev environment is working through Next.dev versus doing that production build and then serving your production server. Now the question is, why does it work this way? Well, this is actually pretty powerful if you understand more of the intention behind it. A route handler is the base of how pages work inside of the app router as well too. And pages can be cached by default. So even if I'm doing an asynchronous component or a server component and I'm fetching some external data, that doesn't necessarily have to run on demand on every single request. It's kind of like instead of a server component, it's a data component, because you can fetch data, you can pre-render a page that only was pre-rendered on the server, and then you don't have to have any additional client.js for that. Long story short, the options for how route handlers work are the same as pages. So by default, this is cached static, which means that anything that I do here to opt into making this dynamic, it will then work the same way as a traditional API route. So for a get, for example, if I were to read request dot something, so maybe I want to read the incoming search parameters, or maybe I want to read the headers, that would opt it into being dynamic. You can also use the helper functions that we have headers as well as cookies that will read from the incoming request. Or more commonly, what I see is that folks are doing a post request. So if you're doing a post request, because you're probably, maybe it's something with webhooks again, post requests will be dynamic by default as well too. Now, the reason that this get pattern, this is very interesting, is because maybe inside of here, I want to do, let's say, let data equals await fetch. Wow, shout out to Luke, who has their user named on here and their amazing contributions to open source. Let's say I want something like this, and then maybe I'll do this. And let me just go back to my dev server here. And we're going to see that it prints out some information about my GitHub profile. Now, the really interesting thing here is in the pages router model, having an API route required that you had a server. But there's also an option in Next.js that allows you to do a static export and basically take the generated files and put them anywhere. Put them on a server somewhere, put them on an S3 bucket somewhere. It doesn't have to be something that's always on, right? So the cool thing about this, again, if I do the build and I start it up, since I have the ability to define this arbitrary route that can generate, maybe it generates JSON, maybe it generates an XML file, maybe it generates a text file, I can do this and it can still be compatible with that static export model. So this would work, and even if we wanted to do a static export, we can still use that. Now, I will say most of the time, you probably don't need to do anything like this with route handlers because you can just call that function directly on the page, the server component instead. Okay, third is thinking that you need a route handler because you're using a client component. So far, I've talked about server components, and your next question might be, yeah, but I'm using route handlers because I have client components. Let's talk about that one as well too. So I changed my page to be a client component. I added a form and a button that takes some event handler for on submit. And then in on submit, I'm just preventing the default and I'm logging submit. So inside of here, what you might say is, okay, so now I need to make a fetch to localhost/API, have my route handler, and then I'm in that tricky state again with having to set up route handlers when maybe I don't need to. So this is what happens. I click send it. I see in the console, I hit submitted. Well, what if I told you that you didn't need to do it this way and you could skip writing all this additional code and just call a server action instead? Yes, server actions can work with your client components as well too. So what if we delete this and we take this and we say, you know what, action is going to equal send, and we import send from our actions. Notably, we're importing it here and we're not putting it in line inside the file. This is a use client file. We're in the client we're on the client boundary here versus this actions on the server. So inside of actions, we have use server, we have this function, send it. And if we go back here, hit save, click send it. Now you notice the logging position was different too. I didn't see my client-side event handler say that it was submitted in the browser. Instead, it just directly called the server and said, send it, which is where I would have that logic that was in my route handler in the first place. So this can drastically simplify things. If you want to take this further as well too, there's some cool things you can do with use optimistic and use form state, use form status, some other built-in utilities to make working with forms better in Next.js, so definitely check that out too. Okay, fourth, we have using Suspense with server components, and I'm going to talk about this through the lens of partial pre-rendering, which is an upcoming addition to Next.js. It's out experimentally right now, but you'll start using Suspense more and more in the future, so it's helpful to start thinking about this now. So in this partial pre-rendering demo, I reload the browser, I see these loading states. This is all defined by my Suspense boundaries, which is super, super helpful. So understanding how Suspense works is a big unlock for the future of Next.js. So let's talk about it. Let me move this back here. What I have is a server component. It's marked async, and I'm making a call to fetch a list of blogs, and then I've enumerated them and listed them out on the page. So for example, if I said, okay, I want this function, let's just say this is blog posts, And we're going to say export default function page. And maybe I want to have some additional information on this page. So I've got this section for my page. I've got an H1. I've got blog post. That all looks fantastic. Now, in a partial pre-rendered world, you'll be able to pre-render all of this. Right now, you're pre-rendering everything because there's no suspense fallback. But there's a reason why you're moving this data fetching closer to your UI is because this will be pre-rendered when you run your build. So you might say, okay, that means that I want to use Suspense with my blog post so that I can have a fallback and let it get pre-rendered or have a loading state. So, you know what? Let's do this. Let's wrap. Let's do Suspense. We'll import that. We'll have a fallback. Cool. So we have this fallback loading, and then we render this here. Okay, so I reload the page, but nothing is happening. Now, the mistake here, and I don't know who would make this. I've definitely never made this mistake. Just kidding. I've definitely made this mistake. Is that you want your Suspense boundary to be higher than your data fetching component. Seems obvious in retrospect, but it definitely happens, and I can understand how people fall into this. So in reality, you'd want something like this. Now, not only can my blog be pre-rendered in the future, but also the fallback state. You probably wouldn't say loading in that world. You might have it be empty, or you might have a loading skeleton, for example. But yeah, this is the difference here. Now, what you're wondering is, okay, well, why am I not seeing that state? And that's because this, by default, is being cached. So another thing to prepare us for this partial pre-rendering future is that I can say I want to make this dynamic. And right now, this function is called unstable no store. So I can import this here. I can reload. And now we're seeing this flicker. And that flicker means that this bit should not be cached. It should run dynamically. And that means that we are seeing the Suspense fallback. Just to make it more dramatic, you see loading as well too. So hopefully that helps. We'll be talking a lot more about Suspense in the future, but at least for now, as you start thinking about your application structure, as you start exploring Suspense, helpful tip to know, I think. Okay, the fifth tip here, the fifth mistake that I see sometimes is understanding how you can use information about the incoming request in your server component. So maybe you want to forward headers to a fetch, for example. You can use the headers function to read those headers, or maybe you want to read the cookies, for example, because you want to look at an authorization cookie that you've stored or a JWT that you've stored. Maybe you want to look at the parameters or the route segment parameters in your URL. Those, as well as the URL search parameters, are actually props on the server component. So you have params and you have search params. So if I wanted to, for example, let's say inside of here, instead of this, let's do a H1, and we're going to read search params dot, let's say hello. Awesome. So inside of here, I'm going to make a new search param hello, and I'm going to say world. And now I'm able to read that incoming information from the request, or I could read the params. If I have dynamic route segments in my URL, I can read those as well too. So there's a couple different ways you can read from that incoming request using some of these built-in functionalities in Next.js. Okay, 6 and 7 for most common mistakes are how to use context providers and where you place them in your application, sometimes placed incorrectly. And the second is the interweaving or the interleaving between server and client components. So for example, if I have my root layout here on the left, you might be thinking, okay, I have some components, I have some dependencies that require React context. Where do I place that provider in my application? Do I have to put it around the lowest component in the tree? Do I need to have it at the top of the tree? Does that mean that everything below it is going to be a client component? Well, this pattern, it's explained in the docs. I want to visually show it a little bit here. Let's imagine that I have some theme provider here, and this is using React context. Now, this can take in some children, and this is a client component. But the ideal place to place this is actually in the root layout. So what we'd want to do, like we show here, is actually take this, and I think I have my file named differently. I think it's called providers. But we would actually want to take that theme provider, wrap it around the children of our root layout. So wrap it around the children of our application. This is still a server component, and that still allows children of this, like the page, for example, that still allows this to be a server component. So the child of a server component can be a client component. This works as we would expect. This actually goes into the next most common mistake I see, which is when you apply use client, does that apply for everything? Does that apply to its children? And how does that relationship work? And I will say this is all new. So while I'm framing these as mistakes, I think they're all learning opportunities for us. So don't feel harsh. I've made all of these mistakes in this video. So this top level layout is a server component, but then the child of it is this children prop here that goes to the page. So the page is a child of the layout. Now the child of this page is this button component. Let's take a look at this button component. This button component is a simple client component that has a counter. So it has some state. You click on it, the state increments, and we see this new state reflected in the button text. So this is already showing how you can weave server and client components, where the question then becomes, what about the children of this component? So for example, let's say that instead here, I'll just do a fragment, and then I'll have this, but then I'll also have another button. And this other button is also a client component. So I have this button, I have another button, and another button here. Do I need to explicitly have use client at the top? Well, the answer, let's find out. The answer is no. And the reason you don't is because you're already in the client boundary here. So the child of this component are going to be client components unless, for example, I take some children and let's say I want to have the children here. You can still weave in the server components as well too. So then maybe here, for example, I know this is kind of a contrived example, but I think it still works. This is a client component. This is a client component. This is a server component, and they can all work together. Now, the big opportunity here and why, yes, it's a mistake, but it's also an opportunity is that we need to have dev tools that help you visualize these things. And we're definitely working on making this experience better so that you can understand the state of how your server and client components work together. Okay, two more, second to last. The mistake I see most commonly is just forgetting to revalidate data after a mutation. So in the Next.js repo, we have this forms example, which I'd recommend checking out. It shows a server component that fetches a list of to-dos. It renders out the list of to-dos. It has a form to add a new to-do. And inside of this form, it uses a lot of the latest features like server actions. So I have an action to submit the form, to add the new to-do. And what I see a lot of folks do is they start using server actions. Maybe they're moving from the older model where they were trying to map it one-to-one to route handlers. And they move to this and they hit the button and they hit submit and they don't see that list of to-dos update. And they're trying to figure out what exactly is happening. Well, what they're probably missing is inside of their action. In this instance, I have a SQL statement here that's inserting a new value into the to-dos table. What they're probably missing is some revalidation, either revalidating the path or by adding a cache tag onto the fetch or onto that bit of data and then revalidating that specific tag. So pretty commonly I see this. I know that caching is still very new right now, and a lot of these are new patterns. We're also working on making caching a little bit easier as well too, but this is one that I see pretty common. Okay, and while we're here, we can talk about the last one, which is throwing a redirect inside of a try-catch. So I can understand how this happens. I definitely made this mistake myself as well too. You're inside of here, you've revalidated your path, and you say, okay, awesome, now I want to redirect back to the index route, for example. Well, internally, the way this redirect is working is it's actually throwing a Next.js specific error. So you would actually want this at the conclusion here. Either that would be after the try catch or in like a finally block. And I think most common where I see this is either in a server action or if you're trying to use it from a client component. So I recently updated the docs here to show an example when you're using a server component, for example, rather than trying to do a redirect inside of an event handler, you would want that to be inside of your server action. If you're wanting to do a redirect on the client side in an event handler, you'd be using the use router hook, which does have the ability to programmatically route and programmatically redirect. Okay, those are 10 common mistakes or common opportunities to learn more about the Next.js App Router that I've seen. I'm sure there's others, and we're definitely working on making some of these more obvious, both in the framework as well in the documentation. So we'd love to hear what other things you'd like to see me talk more about or go more in depth on any of these as well too. Peace.